April 23, 1945. The small town of Herzberg, nestled in the rolling hills of central Germany, lay shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the distant rumble of engines approaching from the west. In the basement of the town's municipal building, 37 German women huddled together, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror. Among them was Margaret Schmidt, a 32-year-old schoolteacher who had spent the past 3 weeks coordinating the evacuation of wounded soldiers from the local hospital. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tattered photograph of her husband, missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. Around her, the other women whispered prayers and held their children close, their minds filled with the propaganda they had absorbed for 12 years about what would happen when enemy forces arrived. They had been told countless times that soldiers from certain backgrounds would exact terrible vengeance upon German civilians, especially women. They believed with absolute certainty that their worst nightmares were about to become reality. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these women could not have imagined was that their encounter with the approaching American troops would completely shatter every assumption they held, leading to one of the most profound transformations of perspective witnessed during the final days of the conflict in Europe. The sound of tank treads grew louder, vibrating through the stone walls of the basement. Margaret felt her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. Beside her, 17-year-old Anna Hoffman sobbed quietly into her mother's shoulder. The girl had been conscripted just 6 weeks earlier to serve in auxiliary communications, tasked with routing messages between military headquarters. Her mother, Frau Hoffmann, a widow whose husband had perished 3 years prior in North Africa, stroked her daughter's hair with mechanical movements, her eyes glazed and distant. Across the cramped space, Elise Bauer, a 45-year-old nurse who had tended to hundreds of wounded men in the hospital upstairs, attempted to maintain composure. She had seen the results of combat up close, had held dying boys barely old enough to shave as they called for their mothers. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment of anticipation, this terrible waiting for what she believed would be unspeakable horror. The vehicles came to a stop somewhere above them. Heavy footsteps echoed through the building. The women pressed themselves against the back wall, some covering their children's eyes. The door at the top of the basement stairs opened with a creak that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and then came voices speaking in English, a language most of them had studied in school but now sounded foreign and threatening. Then the lights were switched on, and Margareta found herself staring at a sight that contradicted everything she had been conditioned to expect. Standing at the bottom of the stairs were 5 American soldiers from the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the independent tank battalions that had fought its way across France and into Germany. What immediately struck Margaret was that 4 of the 5 men were black Americans, their faces showing not hatred or aggression, but rather caution and something that looked surprisingly like concern. The 5th soldier, a white officer, held up his hands in a gesture of peace. Sergeant First Class David Thompson, a 28-year-old from Philadelphia who had worked as a schoolteacher before the conflict, was the first to speak. His voice was steady and deliberately calm. "We are not here to harm anyone," he said in carefully enunciated English. "You are safe now. The conflict is over for you." The women stared in confused silence. Private James Wilson, a 23-year-old from Chicago whose family had migrated north during the Great Migration, noticed a small child clinging to her mother's leg. He slowly removed his helmet and smiled gently. The gesture seemed to break some invisible barrier. The tension did not dissolve completely, but something in the atmosphere shifted. Corporal Robert Jenkins, a farmer's son from Alabama who had joined the service to escape the grinding poverty and discrimination of the segregated South, pulled a chocolate bar from his pack. He approached slowly, offering it to the frightened child. The little girl looked up at her mother, who nodded hesitantly. When the child took the chocolate, her eyes widened with delight, the first genuine smile seen in that basement in days. Lieutenant William Harris, the white officer, spoke again, this time with Sergeant Thompson translating his words into careful German that he had learned during the months of occupation duty. "You will be processed as civilians under temporary military authority. We will arrange for food, medical care, and shelter. No one will be harmed. You have my word as an officer of the United States Army." Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You mean you are not going to—" She could not finish the sentence, could not speak aloud the terrible things she had been told would happen. Sergeant Thompson understood. He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. We are here to establish order and provide humanitarian assistance. That is our mission, and that is what we will do." Over the next hours, the reality of the situation began to penetrate the fog of fear that had gripped the women. The American soldiers organized a systematic evacuation of the basement, carefully documenting each person's name and background. They brought in field rations, the first proper food many of the women had eaten in days. Corporal Jenkins, despite having every reason to harbor resentment toward a nation that had allied with a regime promoting racial theories that classified him as inferior, showed nothing but professional courtesy. He helped elderly Frau Müller up the stairs, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out from exhaustion and malnutrition. Private Wilson set up a makeshift medical station in what had been the town clerk's office. Elise Bauer, the nurse, watched in amazement as he treated wounded German soldiers with the same care he gave to injured American personnel. One young soldier, barely 18 years old with a shrapnel wound in his shoulder that had become infected, looked at Wilson with undisguised confusion. "You are helping me?" the boy asked in broken English. "Why would you help me?" Wilson met his gaze steadily. "Because you are wounded and you need medical attention," he replied simply. "That is what we do." As the day progressed, Margaret found herself in conversation with Sergeant Thompson. She learned that he had a wife and 2 children back in Philadelphia, that he had taught history and literature at a segregated high school before being drafted. He spoke about his experiences with quiet dignity, never boasting, never seeking sympathy. He described how his battalion had landed at Omaha Beach in October of 1944, how they had fought through France and Belgium, how they had provided crucial armored support during the breach of the Siegfried Line. He told her about the 761st's reputation for exceptional performance, how they had destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles and gun positions, how they had been commended for their courage under fire. But what struck Margaret most powerfully was what Thompson did not say. He did not speak of vengeance or retribution. He did not gloat over the defeat of German forces. Instead, he talked about his desire to return home, to see his children grow up, to return to his classroom. When Margaret tentatively asked about his treatment in America, Thompson's expression became complicated. He acknowledged the reality of segregation, the daily indignities, the systematic discrimination. "We fight for a country that does not always treat us as full citizens," he said quietly. "But we fight anyway because we believe in the principles of freedom and democracy, even when those principles are not fully applied to us. We believe that by proving ourselves here, we can help change things at home." This conversation shook something loose in Margaret's understanding of the world. She had been taught that people could be categorized, ranked, judged by immutable characteristics. Yet here was a man who embodied everything her former education had told her was impossible: intelligence, dignity, compassion, and moral courage, all displayed by someone her regime had classified as racially inferior. The cognitive dissonance was profound and disorienting. Over the following days, as American forces established military government in Herzberg, the relationship between the occupying soldiers and the German civilians evolved in unexpected ways. The 761st Tank Battalion remained in the area for 2 weeks before moving on to their next assignment. During that time, the black soldiers of the battalion demonstrated a level of professionalism and humanity that systematically dismantled the prejudices many Germans had internalized. Corporal Jenkins organized work details to repair damaged buildings and restore essential services. He supervised German civilians and former soldiers working side by side, treating everyone with firm but fair authority. When a former German officer objected to taking orders from a black American, Jenkins simply smiled and said, "The conflict is over, sir. We are all just people trying to rebuild now. You can participate in that effort, or you can sit in the prisoner compound. Your choice." The officer, after a long moment, picked up a shovel and joined the work crew. Private First Class Marcus Hayes, A 25-year-old from Detroit, who had worked in an automobile factory before the conflict, proved invaluable in getting the town's water pumping station operational again. He worked alongside German engineers, sharing technical knowledge freely. One of the German men, Herr Dietrich, a middle-aged technician who had maintained the facility for 15 years, initially refused to speak to Hayes, but as they worked together to solve a complex mechanical problem with the pump's drive system, professional respect gradually overcame prejudice. By the third day, Dietrich was actively seeking Hayes's input and even shared his lunch with the young American. The transformation was not universal or immediate. Some German civilians clung to their indoctrinated beliefs, viewing any kindness from the Americans as a trick or manipulation. But for many, especially the women who had experienced those first terrifying moments in the basement, the gap between expectation and reality created a psychological opening for genuine change. Anna Hoffman, the 17-year-old girl who had sobbed in terror that first day, began helping Private Wilson in the medical station. She had trained briefly as a nurse's aide during her auxiliary service, and Wilson welcomed her assistance. As they worked together, treating both German and American patients, Anna began to ask questions. She wanted to understand how the world could be so different from what she had been taught. Wilson answered her questions with patience, explaining his own experiences growing up in Chicago, describing the vibrant community of Bronzeville, the culture and creativity that flourished despite discrimination. He talked about jazz musicians and writers, about churches and businesses, about families and traditions. He painted a picture of humanity in all its complexity, a picture that contradicted the simplistic and dehumanizing propaganda Anna had absorbed. One afternoon, as they cleaned instruments, Anna asked the question that had been troubling her most. How can you not hate us? After everything our country did, everything our forces stood for, how can you treat us with kindness? Wilson was quiet for a long moment, then he said, hate is easy. Hate is what got the world into this mess. But hate does not build anything, does not heal anything, does not solve anything. My grandmother used to say that you fight evil by refusing to become evil yourself. You overcome darkness by being light. That might sound simple or naive, but I have found it to be true. If I responded to hatred with hatred, to cruelty with cruelty, then what would be the difference between me and the people who started this whole terrible conflict? The difference has to be that we choose to be better, to act with humanity even when it would be easier not to. These conversations, multiplied across dozens of interactions between American soldiers and German civilians, began to plant seeds of a different understanding. Margaret started teaching English to some of the other women, using materials that Sergeant Thompson provided. As they practiced conversation, they discussed topics that had been forbidden or distorted by propaganda: democracy, individual rights, the rule of law, the value of diversity. For women who had lived under an authoritarian regime that had controlled information and punished independent thought, these discussions were revelatory. Frau Hoffmann, Anna's mother, had been particularly resistant to changing her views. She had lost her husband in the conflict and had been told for years that Germany's enemies were responsible for all their suffering. But watching her daughter work alongside Private Wilson, seeing the respect and kindness with which the American soldiers treated civilians, slowly eroded her certainty. One evening she approached Sergeant Thompson with hesitant steps. Through Margaret's translation, she asked if she could speak with him. Thompson agreed, and they sat in the evening light on the steps of the municipal building. Frau Hoffmann struggled to articulate what she wanted to say. Finally she managed, I was taught many things, I believed many things. But you and your men, you are not what I was told to expect. You are not monsters. You are just men, good men trying to do a difficult job. I think perhaps I was lied to about many things. Thompson nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Propaganda is a powerful tool. It can make you see enemies where there are only human beings. It can make you fear where you should feel kinship. I'm glad you are willing to question what you were told. That is the first step toward healing and rebuilding. The 2 weeks the 761st Tank Battalion spent in Herzberg became a microcosm of a larger transformation occurring across occupied Germany. The battalion's exceptional conduct was not unique. It was representative of the professionalism displayed by many units. But for the civilians of this small town, these particular soldiers became the face of a different reality, a counter-narrative to years of propaganda. When the battalion prepared to move out, continuing their advance deeper into territory that had not yet surrendered, the farewell was surprisingly emotional. Margaret and several other women gathered to see them off. She had written a letter which she handed to Sergeant Thompson. In it, she tried to express the profound impact his kindness and professionalism had made on her understanding of the world. She wrote about her shame at having believed the lies she had been told, her gratitude for being treated with dignity and respect when she had expected punishment, and her hope that she could help rebuild her country on better foundations. Thompson read the letter, translated portions for his men, and then carefully folded it and placed it in his breast pocket. He shook Margaret's hand firmly. "Teach your students well," he said. "Teach them to think for themselves, to question authority, to treat all people with dignity. That is how you prevent something like this from happening again." As the tanks and trucks of the 761st rolled out of Herzberg, Margaret stood watching until they disappeared from view. Around her, other women wiped tears from their eyes. These were not tears of sorrow at the departure of occupiers, but rather tears of recognition that something important had shifted within them. They had come face to face with their own capacity for prejudice and had seen it contradicted by living reality. They had been offered a chance at redemption through the simple act of being treated as human beings by those they had been conditioned to dehumanize. The impact of these encounters extended far beyond Herzberg. Similar scenes played out in towns and cities across Germany as American forces, including many black soldiers who had fought with distinction throughout the campaign, became agents of occupation and reconstruction. The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers. Soldiers from a nation still grappling with its own legacy of slavery and ongoing racial discrimination were now serving as ambassadors of democratic values to a population that had lived under a regime that had taken racial ideology to genocidal extremes. The 761st Tank Battalion's war record was exemplary by any measure. They had participated in the campaigns across France, Belgium, and Germany, earning commendations for their performance under fire. They had destroyed numerous enemy vehicles, captured thousands of prisoners, and provided essential armored support for infantry advances. But perhaps their most significant contribution was less tangible and harder to quantify. The impact they made on the hearts and minds of civilians they encountered, demonstrating through their conduct that the prejudices upon which recent horrors had been built were fundamentally false. For Margaret Schmidt, the encounter became a defining moment in her life. When schools reopened under American military government supervision, she returned to teaching with a profound sense of mission. She understood that education could be used to liberate or to enslave minds, to build bridges or to construct walls. She dedicated herself to the former, teaching her students to think critically, to question authority, to resist propaganda, to value human dignity above all else. In later years, she would often tell the story of April 23, 1945, when she waited in a basement expecting vengeance and instead received an education in humanity. Anna Hoffman pursued nursing as a career, inspired by her time working with Private Wilson. She eventually emigrated to the United States in the 1950s, settling in Chicago where she worked at a hospital serving predominantly African American communities. She maintained correspondence with Wilson for many years, and when she married and had children, she named her son James in his honor. Her life became a testament to the possibility of transformation, of moving from fear and prejudice to understanding and solidarity. The other women of Herzberg each carried forward their own versions of that transformative experience. Some struggled more than others to fully release the prejudices they had internalized, but even those who found change difficult could not entirely dismiss what they had witnessed. The gap between what they had been told to expect and what actually occurred was too wide to ignore. They had seen with their own eyes that human decency transcends the artificial categories society constructs. Sergeant David Thompson returned to Philadelphia after the conflict ended, resuming his teaching career at the same segregated high school. He spoke rarely about his military service, but when he did, he emphasized the common humanity he had found, even in the midst of humanity's darkest chapter. He kept Margaret's letter in a box with his military papers, and in later years, when the civil rights movement was challenging American segregation, he would sometimes take it out and read it to remind himself that change was possible, that prejudice could be overcome, that education and direct human contact had the power to transform hearts and minds. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion and other Black American units in the conflict became an important chapter in the ongoing struggle for civil rights in the United States. The soldiers who had fought overseas for democratic principles returned home determined to secure those same principles for themselves and their communities. They had proved their courage, competence, and character on battlefields across Europe. They had served as ambassadors of American ideals to populations emerging from authoritarian rule. Now they demanded that America live up to its stated values. The seeds of the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades following the conflict were planted in part by these veterans who refused to accept continued discrimination after having sacrificed so much. For the German people, the process of confronting their nation's recent past was long and painful. It required acknowledging complicity, accepting responsibility, and fundamentally reconsidering values and assumptions that had been taken for granted. The encounters between German civilians and Allied occupation forces, particularly with Black American soldiers, played a role in this process. These interactions challenged Germans to recognize the humanity of those they had been taught to view as inferior, creating cognitive dissonance that opened space for genuine reflection and change. It was not a simple or immediate transformation, and many Germans resisted it. But for those willing to engage honestly with their experience, it became a starting point for building a different future. The small town of Herzberg rebuilt over the years that followed, transforming from a place of fear and destruction into a peaceful community. The municipal building where 37 women had huddled in terror was renovated and continued to serve as the town hall. In the 1980s, when Margaret was an elderly woman preparing to retire from teaching, the town installed a small plaque in the basement commemorating not a battle or a conquest, but an act of humanity. The plaque simply stated that on April 23, 1945, American soldiers had treated German civilians with dignity and respect, offering a model of how former enemies might build peace together. It did not specify that most of those soldiers were Black Americans, but Margaret always made sure to include that detail when she brought her students to see the plaque and tell them the story of that day. The lesson Margaret taught her students over nearly 4 decades was simple but profound. Prejudice is learned, which means it can be unlearned. Fear of the other is cultivated, which means it can be replaced with curiosity and respect. Hatred is taught, which means love and understanding can be taught instead. She would tell them about April 23, 1945, about sitting in a basement expecting vengeance and instead receiving kindness. She would describe Sergeant Thompson's dignity, Private Wilson's compassion, Corporal Jenkins' professionalism. She would explain how these men had every reason to be angry and vengeful, how they had faced discrimination in their own country, how they had fought against an ideology that classified them as racially inferior, and yet how they had chosen to respond with humanity rather than hatred. Margaret would explain to her students that this choice, this determination to meet prejudice with dignity and hatred with compassion, was not weakness, but rather the highest form of strength. It required tremendous moral courage to refuse to become what your enemy claimed you were, to maintain your humanity in the face of dehumanization. She taught them that the real victory was not military but moral, the victory of human dignity over imposed categories, of individual character over group prejudice, of hope over despair. She urged them to carry forward this lesson, to be people who built bridges rather than walls, who saw individuals rather than stereotypes, who had the courage to question what they were told and the wisdom to learn from direct experience. As Margaret aged, she remained in contact with Sergeant Thompson through occasional letters. They shared their experiences of the post-conflict years, the challenges of living in societies still grappling with the consequences of prejudice, the small victories and persistent frustrations of working for change. Thompson told her about the civil rights movement, about the courage of young people sitting at lunch counters and riding buses into danger, about the ongoing struggle to make America's reality match its ideals. Margarete told him about the process of confronting the past in Germany, about the difficulty of acknowledging national shame while also rebuilding national identity, about the new generation growing up who had to learn from history they had not lived through. In one letter written in the early 1960s, Thompson wrote, "I think often about those days in Germany. I think about the women in that basement, about the fear in their eyes, and about how that fear was based on lies they had been told about people like me. I think about how we had a choice in that moment to confirm their fears or contradict them. I am proud that we chose to contradict them, to show them that we were not monsters but men. But I am also aware that showing people their prejudices are false is not enough. Prejudice is comfortable because it is simple. Truth is uncomfortable because it is complex. Changing minds requires not just contradiction of false beliefs, but construction of new understanding. That is the work of education, of culture, of sustained human contact. That is the work you do every day in your classroom, and that is the work we are doing here in America. It is slow and frustrating, and sometimes it seems impossible. But then I remember that day in April of 1945, and I remember that change is possible." Margarete saved all of Thompson's letters, and after his death in 1978, his family sent her a package containing the letter she had written him in April of 1945. It had remained in his papers for more than 3 decades, carefully preserved. She wept when she read her younger self's words, remembering the confusion and shame and hope she had felt writing them. She placed the letter in a frame and hung it in her classroom, where it remained until her retirement. When students asked about it, she would tell them the whole story, beginning to end, sparing no detail. She wanted them to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. The story of Herzberg was not unique. Similar encounters occurred across Germany, and indeed across Europe as American forces occupied former enemy territory. The response of Allied soldiers to civilian populations varied, of course, as human behavior always does. There were instances of misconduct and abuse, but overwhelmingly, American forces, including the segregated black units that had fought with such distinction, behaved with professionalism and humanity. This was particularly remarkable given the horrors that were being uncovered as concentration camps were liberated, as the full scope of industrial genocide became known. The temptation for vengeance must have been strong. The moral courage required to resist that temptation and instead treat enemy civilians with dignity was immense. For black American soldiers specifically, the irony of their situation was profound and complex. They had fought to defeat a regime built on racial ideology while serving in a military that was itself segregated by race. They had proved their courage and competence repeatedly, only to know that they would return home to a society that still denied them full citizenship rights. They had been sent to teach democratic values to Germans, while being denied those same values in their own country. And yet, despite all of this, despite every reason to be bitter and angry, many responded with extraordinary humanity and professionalism. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that prejudice was a lie because they had experienced its falseness directly. They knew that human dignity transcended imposed categories because they had maintained their own dignity in the face of discrimination. They recognized that hatred only breeds more hatred, and that the only way to break that cycle was through deliberate acts of humanity. The transformation that occurred in Herzberg and countless other places was not complete or permanent. Prejudice is persistent and finds new forms when old forms are challenged. But something important had shifted. Germans who had direct contact with black American soldiers had their assumptions challenged in a way that could not be easily dismissed. They had seen with their own eyes that the propaganda they had absorbed was false. This created an opening for reflection, for questioning, for growth. Not everyone took advantage of that opening, but some did, and those who did became agents of change in their own communities. In the broader context of post-conflict reconstruction, the behavior of American occupation forces, including black soldiers, contributed to the relatively successful transformation of Germany from authoritarian state to democratic society. This transformation was not inevitable. It required deliberate effort, sustained commitment and willingness on both sides to move beyond hatred towards something resembling reconciliation. The Marshall Plan provided economic resources for rebuilding, but economics alone could not have achieved the deeper transformation that occurred. That required human connections, individual encounters that challenged prejudice and built understanding. The soldiers of units like the 761st Tank Battalion were part of creating those connections, often without realizing the long-term significance of their actions. Margaret Schmidt passed away in 1993 at the age of 80. Her funeral was attended by former students spanning 4 decades, many of whom shared stories of how she had shaped their understanding of history, morality, and human dignity. Several mentioned specifically her story of April 23, 1945, and how it had influenced their own choices and values. One former student, who had become a teacher himself, spoke about how Margarete had taught him that the purpose of studying history was not to memorize dates and facts, but to learn about human nature, about the capacity for both evil and good, about the choices individuals make and the consequences of those choices. He said that her lesson about the day American soldiers chose humanity over vengeance had shaped his entire approach to education and to life. Anna Hoffman, who had maintained her connection to the town despite emigrating to America, returned for Margaret's funeral. She was an elderly woman herself now, her son James accompanying her. She spoke at the service, telling the gathered mourners about that April day when she had been a terrified 17-year-old girl, certain that terrible things were about to happen, and how instead she had received an education in humanity that had shaped her entire life. She talked about Private James Wilson, for whom her son was named, and about how that young soldier's kindness had opened her eyes to the falseness of what she had been taught. She said that Margaret had helped her understand and process that experience, had given her the tools to think critically and act morally, and had inspired her to pursue a life of service to others. The town of Herzberg continued to evolve over the decades. The generation that had lived through the conflict gradually passed away, replaced by new generations who knew those events only through history books and family stories. But the lesson Margaret had taught, the story she had told again and again to her students, became part of the town's collective memory. The plaque in the municipal building basement remained, and every year on April 23rd, the local school brought students to see it and hear the story. The tradition continued into the 21st century, ensuring that the lesson of that day, the message that prejudice can be overcome through direct human contact and moral courage, was not lost. In America, the story of the 761st Tank Battalion and other black combat units gradually became better known as historians worked to document the full complexity of American involvement in the conflict. For many years, the contributions of black soldiers had been minimized or ignored in mainstream narratives, but as civil rights advances made it possible to tell more complete stories, the remarkable record of units like the 761st began to receive proper recognition. Their military achievements were impressive: hundreds of enemy vehicles destroyed, thousands of prisoners taken, crucial support provided for infantry advances. But perhaps their more lasting contribution was the example they set, both for German civilians who encountered them, and for future generations of Americans who learned that courage and competence have nothing to do with race. The veterans of the 761st who survived the conflict and returned home became part of the generation that would challenge American segregation and work towards civil rights. They carried with them the knowledge that they had proved themselves equal to any soldiers, that they had represented their country with distinction, that they had demonstrated humanity and professionalism in the most difficult circumstances. This knowledge gave them moral authority to demand full citizenship rights. When white Americans argued that black citizens were not ready for equality, these veterans could point to their service and ask, if we were good enough to fight for democracy overseas, why are we not good enough to enjoy democracy at home? The connection between military service in the conflict and the civil rights movement that followed was direct and powerful. The Double V campaign, Victory Over Fascism Abroad and Victory Over Racism at Home, articulated the aspirations of black Americans who understood that the conflict's ideals of freedom and democracy had to be applied universally to have real meaning. The soldiers who had occupied Germany and treated former enemies with dignity, now demanded that their own country treat them with equal dignity. The same moral courage that had led them to respond to prejudice with professionalism now led them to confront injustice at home. The story of Margaret Schmidt and the women of Herzberg encountering the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion became, in its way, a parable about the possibility of transformation. It demonstrated that prejudice, however deeply ingrained, could be confronted and overcome through direct experience that contradicted false assumptions. It showed that individuals have agency, that they can choose how to respond to others, and that those choices have consequences rippling far beyond the immediate moment. It illustrated that moral courage sometimes means doing the harder thing, treating others with dignity, even when it would be easier to respond with anger or cruelty. And it proved that education and human connection have the power to change hearts and minds in ways that force alone never can. In the decades since April 1945, historians and sociologists have studied the process by which Germany transformed from totalitarian state to democratic society. They have identified many factors: the complete military defeat that discredited the old regime, the division of the country that created different paths of development, the Marshall Plan's economic support, the deliberate process of confronting past atrocities, the generational change as young people grew up in a different system. But beneath all these structural factors were countless individual encounters, moments when people had to choose whether to cling to old prejudices or embrace new understanding. The meeting in that Herzberg basement was one such encounter, multiplied thousands of times across the occupied territory. For the Black American soldiers involved in these encounters, their behavior reflected the traditions and values of communities that had maintained dignity and humanity through centuries of oppression. The decision to respond to potential enemies with professionalism rather than vengeance was not naive or weak. It was a conscious choice rooted in deep moral understanding. These soldiers knew from personal experience that prejudice was false, that stereotypes were lies, that human dignity transcended imposed categories. They had been told throughout their lives that they were inferior, and they had proved through their own achievement that such claims were nonsense. Now they had the opportunity to demonstrate to others that prejudice was false, and many rose to that opportunity with remarkable grace. The legacy of units like the 761st Tank Battalion extends beyond their immediate military achievements. They helped to change American society by proving black soldiers equal capability and by gaining moral authority to demand civil rights. They helped to change German society by challenging prejudices and demonstrating alternative ways of treating others. They provided a model of how to respond to hatred with humanity, to meet prejudice with dignity, to overcome darkness with light. Their story is a reminder that individuals have the power to choose their response to circumstances and that those choices matter profoundly. Margarete Schmidt's life work of teaching this lesson to successive generations of students represented her own form of moral courage. She could have remained silent about her prejudices, could have tried to forget the shame of having believed propaganda that dehumanized others. Instead, she chose to confront that past honestly, to acknowledge her own capacity for prejudice, and to dedicate herself to ensuring that future generations would not make the same mistakes. Her willingness to be vulnerable, to admit to her students that she had been wrong, that she had believed lies, gave her teaching authenticity and power. She was not lecturing from a position of moral superiority, but sharing a hard-won understanding gained through direct experience. The transformation that occurred in Herzberg, and in Margaret specifically, illustrates an important truth about prejudice and how it can be overcome. Prejudice is not primarily an intellectual position that can be defeated through logical argument. It is an emotional and psychological stance, often defended by selective attention to evidence that confirms pre-existing beliefs. The most effective way to challenge prejudice is through direct personal experience that contradicts stereotypes so clearly that the contradiction cannot be ignored. When Margaret expected vengeance and received kindness, when she anticipated monsters and encountered dignified professionals, the gap between expectation and reality was too wide to dismiss. That gap created cognitive dissonance that opened her mind to reconsidering everything she had been taught. This same pattern repeated countless times across Germany as civilians encountered American occupation forces. The actual behavior of Allied soldiers, particularly black American soldiers, who had every reason to be bitter and angry, but who largely conducted themselves with professionalism and humanity, contradicted the propaganda that Germans had absorbed. For some Germans, this contradiction could be explained away or ignored, but for others, particularly those like Margaret who had the courage to confront it honestly, the contradiction became an opportunity for growth and transformation. They recognized that they had been lied to about many things, and that recognition opened them to building new understanding based on reality rather than propaganda. The story also illustrates the power of individual agency and moral choice. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion could have chosen differently. They could have responded to German civilians with anger or cruelty. They could have sought revenge for the discrimination they had faced in their own country, or for the ideological evil they had fought against. No one would have blamed them for harboring such feelings, but they chose instead to act with professionalism and humanity. That choice was not easy or automatic. It required conscious effort to maintain discipline and to treat people as individuals rather than as representatives of a hated system. It was a choice to be the better person, to respond to darkness with light, and that choice had consequences far beyond anything they could have anticipated in the moment. Similarly, Margaret and the other women in that basement had choices to make. When their initial fears proved unfounded, when they were treated with unexpected dignity, they could have explained it away as an isolated incident or as manipulation. They could have clung to their prejudices despite contradictory evidence. But some of them, particularly Margaret, chose instead to confront honestly what they had experienced, to acknowledge that they had been wrong, and to build new understanding. That choice was also not easy. It required humility to admit error, courage to question what she had been taught, and determination to act on her new understanding. But that choice too had consequences, rippling out through decades of teaching, through generations of students, through a community's collective memory. The soldiers returned home carrying memories of these encounters. For some, the experience of being treated as liberators and occupiers, so of being respected and even appreciated by German civilians, stood in sharp contrast to the discrimination they still faced in America. The irony was painful and infuriating. They had been good enough to fight for freedom, good enough to represent American values to former enemies, but not good enough to enjoy full citizenship rights at home. This realization fueled determination to challenge segregation and demand change. The civil rights movement that transformed America in the decades following the conflict was driven in part by veterans who refused to accept continued discrimination after having served their country with distinction. For others, the experience provided a more complex understanding of human nature and social systems. They had seen how propaganda could warp people's perceptions, how fear could be manipulated, how prejudice could be learned and therefore unlearned. They had witnessed transformation in individuals like Margaret, who had the courage to question what they had been taught. This gave them hope that similar transformation was possible in America, that prejudice was not inevitable or permanent, that direct human contact and sustained effort could change hearts and minds. They brought this understanding into their work for civil rights, combining demands for structural change with efforts to build human connections across racial divides. The decades following the conflict saw both Germany and America grappling with their legacies of racial prejudice, though in very different contexts and with different histories. Germany had to confront the reality of industrial genocide, the systematic murder of millions based on pseudo-scientific racial theories. This confrontation was painful and incomplete, and even today historians debate how thoroughly Germany has reckoned with this past. But the process of confrontation and transformation did occur, and encounters like the one in Herzberg played a role by challenging prejudices and opening minds to different possibilities. America had to confront its own history of slavery and ongoing discrimination, a confrontation that is still unfolding. The courage of veterans like those from the 761st Tank Battalion helped to drive this process forward by demanding that American reality match American ideals. As Margaret grew old, She reflected often on the arc of her life and the role that one April day had played in shaping it. She understood that she had been given a gift in that moment of terror, transforming into relief and then into understanding. She had been given the opportunity to confront her own prejudice and to choose transformation. Not everyone received such a clear contradiction of their false beliefs. Not everyone had the courage to act on that contradiction, even when they experienced it. But she had both experienced it and had the courage to build her life around the lesson it taught. In her final years, she felt deep gratitude for that gift, even as she felt shame about having needed it in the first place. When the Cold War ended and Germany reunified, Margarete was among those celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall. She saw in that moment the culmination of the process that had begun decades earlier, the transformation of Germany from totalitarian state to democratic society. She knew that the process had been neither simple nor complete, that challenges remained, that eternal vigilance was required to protect freedom and human dignity. But she also knew that change was possible, that societies could transform, that individuals could overcome prejudice and build understanding. She had lived that transformation herself and had helped to foster it in hundreds of students. As she watched jubilant crowds dismantling the wall, she thought about Sergeant Thompson and his men, about that April day when they had chosen humanity over vengeance, and about how that choice had rippled forward through the decades. The story of the encounter in Hertzberg, like many stories from that period, gradually faded from immediate awareness as the decades passed and the generation that lived through those events passed away. But it remained preserved in letters, in photographs, in the plaque on the municipal building wall, in family stories passed down through generations. And periodically, historians or journalists would rediscover it and bring it back into public consciousness. Each time the story was retold, it offered the same lesson. That prejudice can be overcome through direct human contact, that moral courage means choosing humanity over hatred, that individuals have agency and their choices matter. That transformation is always possible for those willing to confront uncomfortable truths. The detailed accounts left by participants on both sides provide remarkable insight into the psychological and emotional dimensions of these encounters. Sergeant Thompson kept a journal throughout his service, and his entries from late April 1945 reveal a thoughtful man wrestling with complex emotions. In one entry dated April 24th, he wrote about the contradictions of his situation. "Here I am, thousands of miles from home, helping to administer a defeated enemy population, and the German civilians treat me with more respect than I often receive in Philadelphia. They call me Sergeant, they listen when I give instructions, they thank me for my help. Meanwhile, back home I would not be allowed to eat in certain restaurants or stay in certain hotels. My children attend segregated schools. My wife faces daily indignities. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. But I do not take it out on these people. They have their own burden of guilt to carry. My job is to represent American ideals, even when America does not always live up to those ideals itself. If I can show these Germans that the propaganda they believed was false, then maybe I am helping to build a better world, even if my own country still has a long way to go." Private Wilson also maintained correspondence with his family that provides valuable perspective. In a letter to his mother dated May 1st, 1945, he described his experience treating German patients. "Mama, you would be proud of how I have conducted myself here. I remember what you always taught me, that hatred poisons the person who feels it more than the person it is directed at. I have treated German soldiers and civilians with the same care I would give anyone, and you should see the looks on their faces. Some of them clearly expected me to refuse treatment or to be rough with them. When I am gentle and professional, when I take time to explain what I am doing and to make sure they are comfortable, I can see their whole worldview shifting. One old woman actually started crying and took my hand and thanked me. She said she had been told terrible things about people who looked like me, and she was ashamed that she had believed those lies. Mama, I felt like I was doing something more important than just medicine in that moment. I was helping to heal something deeper than physical wounds. I was showing her the truth, and the truth was setting her free from fear and hatred. That is what this conflict should have been about all along, fighting for truth and human dignity." I am proud to be part of that mission, even though it is hard being so far from home." Corporal Jenkins wrote to his young wife back in Alabama, and his letters reveal both the challenges and the rewards of occupation duty. In one letter, he described an incident that illustrated the complexity of the situation. "Yesterday we were distributing food rations, and an elderly German man refused to accept food from me. He stood there with his arms crossed, just glaring. My first instinct was to be angry, but then I remembered what Pastor Williams used to preach about how responding to hatred with anger just creates more hatred. So instead, I smiled at the old man and said through our translator, 'Sir, I understand this is difficult for you. You were taught to believe certain things, and now reality does not match what you were taught. That can be confusing and upsetting. But the fact remains that you need food, and I am authorized to provide it. When you are ready to accept it, I will be here.' Then I moved on to help the next person in line. About an hour later, that old man came back. He still did not look happy, but he held out his ration card. I took it, marked it off, and gave him his supplies, treating him with exactly the same courtesy I showed everyone else. He mumbled something that might have been thank you and walked away. My translator told me later that the old man said to someone else in line that he had expected me to be cruel or angry when he refused, and when I was not, it confused him. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to meet people's low expectations. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple human kindness. These primary source materials, preserved in archives and family collections, provide intimate glimpses into how individual soldiers process their experiences. They reveal men who were acutely aware of the historical significance of their moment, who understood that they were not just occupying defeated territory, but potentially shaping future relationships between peoples and nations. They show remarkable emotional intelligence and moral sophistication, particularly given that many of these men were in their early to mid-20s, coming from communities that had faced systematic oppression for generations. Their ability to respond to a defeated enemy population with professionalism and compassion, rather than with the bitterness and anger they had every right to feel, speaks to the strength of character fostered by families and communities that had to develop deep reserves of resilience to survive in a hostile environment. The German civilians who experienced these encounters also left records, though fewer of them, as immediate post-conflict conditions made documentation difficult. But in later years, as oral history projects sought to capture memories of the conflict's end, many German civilians shared their experiences. Frau Bauer, the nurse who had worked alongside Private Wilson, was interviewed in the 1970s for a local history project. She recalled, "Those first weeks after American forces arrived were among the most disorienting of my entire life. Everything I had been taught, everything I had believed about the world, was turned upside down. I had expected conquerors to be brutal, especially soldiers I had been told to fear most. Instead, I found professional medical personnel who taught me new techniques and treated patients with care regardless of their background. I found young men who spoke about their families with love, who showed me photographs of parents and siblings, who asked about my own family with genuine interest. They made it impossible to maintain my prejudices because they contradicted those prejudices with every interaction." Looking back, I realized that those weeks were my real education. Everything before had been indoctrination. Those American soldiers, especially Private Wilson and Sergeant Thompson, showed me what it meant to be a truly educated person, someone who could maintain their humanity and their principles even in the most difficult circumstances. Herr Dietrich, the technician who had initially refused to work with Private Hayes, but eventually became his collaborator, also left an account in a memoir he wrote in the 1980s. He described his transformation. "I was a trained engineer, supposedly a man of science and reason, yet I had accepted pseudo-scientific racial theories without question because they were promoted by authority figures and because they made me feel superior without having to earn that feeling through achievement. When I was forced by circumstances to actually work with Private Hayes, to solve real technical problems together, I could not maintain those false beliefs. He was clearly intelligent, skilled, and knowledgeable. We communicated through a mixture of technical diagrams, basic German-English vocabulary, and the universal language of engineering. When we finally got that pump working again, we shook hands, and in that moment, I felt ashamed. I was ashamed that I had ever believed I was inherently superior to this young man, based on nothing but superficial characteristics. I was ashamed that I had participated, even passively, in a system built on such lies. But I was also grateful, because Hayes could have refused to work with me. He could have let me fail out of justified resentment. Instead, he treated me as a fellow professional, and in doing so, he gave me the opportunity to confront my own prejudice and to become a better person. I have spent the rest of my life trying to live up to the example he set in those few days. These testimonies from both soldiers and civilians illustrate the profound psychological impact of encounters that contradicted deeply held prejudices. Psychologists who have studied prejudice reduction identify several key factors that make attitude change possible: direct personal contact, equal status interaction, cooperation toward common goals, and institutional support for new attitudes. The situation in Herzberg and similar towns across occupied Germany contained all of these elements. American soldiers and German civilians had direct personal contact. The military authority structure gave American soldiers higher official status, but in many practical interactions, particularly those involving technical problems or community rebuilding, the interaction was between functional equals working together. They cooperated toward common goals of restoring services, caring for wounded and sick, and establishing stable conditions. And the official policy of American military government, whatever its limitations in practice, supported treating German civilians humanely and working toward reconstruction rather than prolonged punishment. The broader historical context also mattered. By late April 1945, the conflict in Europe was clearly ending. The German regime was collapsing. The full horror of concentration camps was being revealed to the world. German civilians were confronting the reality of what had been done in their name. In this context of total defeat and moral collapse, the unexpected humanity shown by American soldiers, particularly by black soldiers who might have been expected to harbor the most resentment, provided a psychological lifeline. It suggested that redemption might be possible, that Germans could rebuild their society on different foundations, that they did not have to be forever defined by the evil their nation had committed. This was not forgiveness, certainly not forgetting, but it was a suggestion that transformation was possible for those willing to do the hard work of confronting truth and building new understanding. The 761st Tank Battalion moved on from Herzberg in early May, continuing their advance until the formal German surrender made further military operations unnecessary. They participated in the occupation of Austria and were eventually stationed near Salzburg, where they spent the summer of 1945 on occupation duty. Lieutenant Harris was promoted to captain and given command of a company. Sergeant Thompson was recommended for officer candidate school but declined, saying he wanted to return to civilian life and his teaching career as soon as possible. Private Wilson received a commendation for his medical work. Corporal Jenkins was promoted to sergeant. Private Hayes returned to Detroit after his discharge and used his military benefits to attend engineering school, eventually becoming a successful designer in the automotive industry. The battalion was deactivated in March of 1946, and its personnel returned to civilian life in America. They came home to a country still deeply segregated, still denying them full citizenship rights, still maintaining the system of discrimination they had left behind when they entered service. Some found this return to second-class status unbearable after having been treated with respect in Germany. Others channeled their frustration into activism, joining or supporting civil rights organizations. Still others focused on building businesses and institutions within their own communities, creating the economic and social infrastructure that would support the civil rights movement in the years ahead. All of them carried memories of their military service, of the respect they had earned through their performance, of the lives they had touched through their example. The impact of the 761st and other black combat units extended beyond individual veterans to shape collective consciousness in African American communities. When veterans returned home and shared their experiences, when they talked about being treated with respect by German civilians and European allies, when they described fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home, they articulated a contradiction that became increasingly impossible to ignore. The Double V campaign slogan, "Victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home," captured this sentiment. If Black Americans were good enough to fight and win a global conflict, how could they not be good enough to vote without restriction, to attend good schools, to work in any profession for which they were qualified, to live wherever they could afford? This argument, backed by the undeniable record of black military service, provided powerful ammunition for the civil rights movement. When white Americans argued for maintaining segregation and discrimination, civil rights advocates could point to the combat record of units like the 761st and ask if these men were good enough to represent America to the world, to occupy and administer former enemy territory, to demonstrate American values to populations emerging from totalitarian rule, why are they not good enough to enjoy those same American values at home? The question was unanswerable within the logic of segregation, and increasingly, white Americans who considered themselves patriotic and fair-minded found themselves unable to maintain support for a system that so obviously contradicted American ideals. In Hertzburg, life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy over the months and years following the conflict's end. The immediate crisis of defeat and occupation gave way to the long process of reconstruction and the even longer process of confronting moral responsibility for recent atrocities. The women who had huddled in that basement in April of 1945 returned to their daily lives, teaching, nursing, raising children, rebuilding homes and businesses. But they carried with them the memory of that transformative encounter, and many of them found ways to act on what they had learned. Margaret Schmidt's decision to dedicate her teaching career to promoting critical thinking and human dignity was the most direct. But others contributed in their own ways. Frau Hoffmann, Anna's mother, became involved in an organization that hosted exchange students, bringing young people from different countries to live with German families and attend German schools. She saw this as a way to build the kind of direct human contact that had changed her own understanding. When she hosted her first student, a young man from France whose father had been in the resistance, the two families initially approached each other with wariness, but over the months of the exchange, genuine relationships developed. Frau Hoffmann's grandchildren and the French student's siblings became pen pals, continuing to correspond for decades. These small acts of bridge building, multiplied across thousands of families, helped to transform relationships between former enemies, creating the foundation for European integration in the decades that followed. Elise Bauer, the nurse, took a position at a hospital that specialized in treating refugees and displaced persons, populations that faced enormous medical needs in the chaotic post-conflict years. She worked alongside doctors and nurses from many countries, and she brought to that work the lesson she had learned from Private Wilson, that professional medical care should be provided to all patients regardless of their background, that human suffering demands human response, that the highest calling of medicine is to serve humanity without distinction. In the years before her retirement, she trained dozens of younger nurses, always emphasizing these principles and telling them about the American medical corpsman who had demonstrated these ideals through his example. The younger generation, those like Anna Hoffmann, who had been teenagers during the conflict's end, carried the lessons of those encounters into their adult lives in particularly powerful ways. They had been old enough to have absorbed some of the propaganda of the previous regime, but young enough to be genuinely open to new understanding. Many of them became active in building the new democratic Germany, participating in political parties, labor unions, civic organizations, and cultural institutions that worked to create a society based on different values. Hannah's emigration to America and her career serving African American communities represented one path of transformation, but she was far from alone in seeking to live out the implications of what she had learned in those transformative weeks. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.